Back-to-back Formula One weekends, and we go to the Singapore GP where the first night race was ever held in F1 and had plenty of crazy moments. The Singapore track is the most technical track that Formula One offers in the calendar year, and ever since it's made its debut in 2008, there's been so many moments, and it's been a very memorable GP to go to. The track used to have a layout with something called the Singapore Sling, and was one of the most entertaining parts of the track. Sadly, we don't have it anymore, as it would probably be deemed unsafe as to how these drivers were taking this line. It famously flung up Kimi Räikkönen, Adrian Sutil, Kamui Kobayashi, plenty of other drivers. It was definitely a very interesting corner to take. Sticking with the 2008 theme, there was also that crazy pit stop that pretty much cost Massa the championship in 2008. This is probably the most dramatic moment that's ever happened here, but when it comes to crashes like 2017 with Vettel and the Räikkönen Ferrari crash, with also Max Verstappen being a victim of what happened, this caused a big spark within that Ferrari team, and the shift was definitely starting in 2017, and 2018 is what I think broke the trust, and that's why we have now Leclerc as the leader of Ferrari from 2019 pretty much onwards. But going back to 2008, what's probably one of the biggest moments to ever happen in Formula One is Crashgate. Now, to those that don't know, Fernando Alonso won the 2008 race in Renault, and at the time this was seen as huge because it was his first win back with Renault Racing. Basically, the driver went to go pit, he started on super soft tires, pit very early to everybody else, and then all of a sudden his teammate crashed, which was the perfect opportunity for Fernando to actually go up into P1 because everybody else had to pit, so he ended up inheriting the lead and ended up winning the race. It was later found out by the driver that actually crashed, which was Nelson Piquet Jr., that Renault had told him intentionally to crash the car so a safety car would come out and Fernando would win the race. It was a very big controversy and also very against the rules in Formula One. 2023 also saw a winner that was not Max Verstappen. 22 had some pretty dramatic moments in the qualifying. It always offers something because of its layout. The track itself is very technical and very complicated. The first part, it has 62 laps. They say that these are the hardest 62 laps of the whole year, and now 19 corners. It used to have more, but there is a new addition to the track, which is now 4 DRS zones rather than the 3 that we had last year. And while I do believe this is extreme, I guess we might now see some overtakes going into 16 and 17. I really don't believe that's going to happen, but there's a possibility now with a 4th DRS zone. We're going from a C3 to a C5, very soft tires. I'll go more over why I think they choose this and why we could see some different strategies. The traction here is very high, usually because of the heat, and the asphalt itself actually provides pretty well for the Pirelli tires, but tire stress says that it's a 2 here, but it's typically not. We only see a 2 because teams will go for these weird strategies and try to not go in the pit stop as much as possible. And typically, it's better to go for a 1 stop over a 2. The braking is going to be a 5, which also includes the downforce at being a 5. You're going to see the biggest wings here, biggest front wings. The teams are going to go for as much downforce as possible because it provides a way better lap time, and with track evolution being super high due to it being a street track and there being no buildup from previous races being here, going last in the lap is risky, but can be very rewarding. Going over the tire strategy we saw in 2023, it was a 1 stop for pretty much everybody, but Sainz, Norris, Lewis, Leclerc, everybody that was in the top 5, 6, 7, even 8 cars, at some point were driving pretty much 4 seconds slower a lap than it was in 2022, and this is because they wanted to go for the 1 stop. Now, the only drivers that pit and probably would have won the race if it was roles reversed was Lewis and George. George crashed out at the very end, but they were catching these drivers at a crazy pace. The actual 2 stop was the faster strategy, so we could see teams adopt to this because the tire stress is pretty high in Singapore. Another big factor as to why we could see a 2 stop is we could see 2 intermediates in this race. It's going to be very rainy, and it looks like the probability is just gonna stick with being around that 90%. So the chance of not getting rain is very slim, and it could be a very fun Singapore GP. But with all that being said, let's go over a lap at Singapore. Now, starting lap on the start finish line, which is pretty far from turn 1. Turn 1 is going to be a big braking zone that you go as right as possible to prioritize the exit and nail turn 2, which then will go into turn 3, which is a very tricky spot, but yet again, you prioritize the exit to get a good run into turn 4. Then turn 4 ends up being a slight break going into 5, where the cars will run very close to the wall, but this is the main overtaking spot. 6, I guess, is a corner, but then you go into 7, which is the start of sector 2, hard braking zone. Most of the overtakes happen here, but if it's possible, you want to shift your car as right as possible to prioritize the exit yet again. That's going to be a common theme here in Singapore. We then go into 8, which is a tricky zone because you want to brake hard, but actually hitting this and getting the downforce and grip in this spot can be difficult sometimes. That leads us into turn 9, where you want to go as right as possible to prioritize yet again another mini straight, which then leads into turn 10, a hard braking zone. This is where the Singapore sling used to be, but 10 leads into a very tricky turn 11 and turn 12, which then leads into turn 13, which is a hairpin. Sometimes overtakes happen here if you do the incredible one like Massa did years ago, but usually not. It ends up resulting kind of like what happened with Perez and Albon. But this leads into a straight, and we did see some overtakes here, but it was very rare and the tire offset had to be pretty big. That leads us into sector 3, which is a hard braking zone into turn 14, prioritizing the exit yet again. We then have the turn 15, which is flat out, but then 16, hard braking zone, goes into 17. This used to go into a big tunnel section, which was super slow. But right out of 17, you pretty much go into 18 and 19. It's almost flat out, but nailing this can really make or break a lap. The track itself offers so many difficulties, and it's a very high chance we're going to see a safety car here because doing 62 laps perfectly here in Singapore, especially at a very high rate of pace, is super hard to come by, which is usually why the drivers are driving so much slower in the race times. But with that out of the way, we can go over the predictions for the best, the worst teams, and my top 5. The best teams here, let's go over them quickly. McLaren will be the fastest car, but I do believe Ferrari is tied up for that P1 position. I don't want to really give one P1 or P2. They're both very close, and I fully believe that Ferrari, in tracks like this, where it's 90-degree angles, supposedly now that flexi front wing is coming to Singapore rather than Coda, I do think they will be as fast as McLaren, but McLaren was fast in Monaco before, and they probably had the fastest car before. Let's see if Ferrari can turn that around. Leclerc has always been a master in these types of tracks, but Carlos is also very strong here as well. So it's going to be interesting to see between these 4 drivers like your Piastri, like your Lando, Carlos, and Leclerc, who can come out on top from the 4 of them. I do believe Mercedes will closely follow behind. This is a track they've been waiting for. They like the slow speed stuff. Typically, this W15 has weird characteristics. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not. But I do think, especially if it's wet, this Merc car will be quick. The worst teams, the 3 worst teams here, very obvious in my opinion: Sauber, RB, and Alpine. And the reasons for it is I do believe that these cars are a step behind on the Williams, the Aston, and the Haas, unless there's big upgrades. And supposedly RB has very big upgrades here. And Alpine has something rumored for Coda. That's all that I know of as of right now. As for the top 5 and the finishing 5 in this race, it's going to be tricky. But let's say there's no rain. If there's no rain and we just go flat out off of car performance, I have Lewis in P5, which will closely follow the other top 4. And as I stated before, I really think it's McLaren versus Ferrari at this GP. I have Carlos in P4. I have Oscar in P3. He's been phenomenal, but I think the other 2 drivers might slightly have the edge on him depending on what happens in the race. And with that being said, it's either Ferrari or McLaren, and I'm going to say Leclerc in P2. Lando will get his 3rd victory of the year, also revitalizing himself in this championship and bringing him a lot closer, especially with Max being out of the top 5. But I'll say this: if it rains, I believe, and I'm going to make the prediction, if there's rain, Lewis gets the victory. I think the veterans are going to come in hot. I think Fernando will find himself very close towards the top. Maybe not at a podium, but he's going to bring that green tractor somewhere very high. for its expectations. And I do think Max could be on the podium as well if it rains. It'll be very tricky to hold those guys back because they're just masters in the wet, specifically Lewis, Max, and Fernando. And while I do believe Lando and Leclerc and Piastri and Sainz to all be good in the wet, they're not as good as those three. But that's going to wrap it up for Singapore. I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments below. Please leave a like, subscribe. It would mean the world. And peace.